Generally, time has expired. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here. Just to clarify, you knew we had a presence.
Of course I knew. I knew, Congressman, of course.
And going back to an earlier question, you were also aware of those two attacks on our compounds, even though you didn't email about it.
Yes, I was aware.
And that, I think, sort of points out, I mean, after 17 months and $4.7 million, as the ranking member pointed out in his opening statements, and then as we've seen today, this committee is simply not doing its job. And I don't really think it should have been formed in the first place. But what we've heard here is, well, first of all, an obsession with email. The idea that two fairly junior level staffers might not have gotten something wrong in what they heard, or that information in an email might in fact not be accurate, are certainly not things that should be news to anybody. But it is the obsession with the emails that takes us off of what should have been the task of this committee. I also find it interesting that Ms. Roby's final comments were to quote the ARB report. Right. And yes, the ARB report I think was very good. I think we absolutely had to have it, and I think it was appropriate for the committees in Congress to do the investigations that they did. But all of that begs the question as to why we've spent the $4.7 million that we have spent on this. And then even in the chairman's opening remarks, it was primarily a defense of the committee's existence. Not any new information, not here's what we, in those 17 months and $4.7 million, have figured out that is new and different. Nothing. In fact, we've heard nothing, even in today's hearing, not a single solitary thing that hasn't already been discussed repeatedly. So we've learned absolutely nothing. Yes, we've uncovered a trove of new information.
None of these emails should have been on any kind of unclassified system.
In this age, I don't think there's ever an end to the emails. We could probably go on for another 2 years and we'd find more. But the question is, have we found anything substantively that tells us something different about what happened in Benghazi? And the answer
also developed evidence that the security culture of the State Department, in general, and with respect to the use of unclassified systems in particular, was generally lacking in the kind of care for classified information that's found elsewhere in the U.S. government.
that question is no. And look, I didn't think this committee should have been formed in the first place. But if it was going to be formed, the least we could do would be to actually focus on the 4 brave Americans who were killed, why they were killed, and focus on Benghazi. And we have not. I mean, Mr. Roskam's questions I found to be the most interesting. Basically, I don't know, it was like he was running for president. He wanted to debate you on overall Libya policy as to why we got in there in the first place. And that's debatable, and I think you will argue that quite well. But that's not about the attack on Benghazi. That's not about what we could have done in Benghazi to better protect them. So again, I think we've seen that this committee is focused on you. And I'm, the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee.
She also used her personal email extensively while outside the United States, including sending and receiving work-related emails in the territory of sophisticated adversaries.
I don't see the Department of Defense here. I don't see the CIA here. There were many, many other agencies involved in this, and yet yours has been the one that they have obsessively focused on.
That any reasonable person in Secretary Clinton's position, or in the position of those with whom she was corresponding about those matters, should have known that an unclassified system was no place for that conversation.
And I think that's a shame for a whole lot of reasons. But for one thing, this committee, as it's been in the news in the last several weeks, has been yet one more step in denigrating this institution. And I happen to think this institution needs more support, not less. So I wish we would stop doing that. And you mentioned Beirut, and that was the first thought that occurred to me when this happened, was a Democratic Congress at the time did a fair and quick investigation of what was an unspeakable tragedy. 2 separate suicide bombings, 4 months apart. And there was clearly inadequate security. But the focus there was not on partisanship, not on embarrassing the Reagan administration, but on actually figuring out what happened and how we can better protect Americans. Now, I want to talk and ask questions about what I think is the central issue, and that is, how do we have that presence in the world that you described in what is an increasingly dangerous world. Because as I've traveled to Pakistan and Afghanistan, Yemen, and other places, I'm consistently amazed by the willingness of our diplomatic corps to put their lives at risk. And I wonder, how do you balance that very difficult decision? Because frankly, what I've heard more often from that diplomatic corps is that they chafe at the restrictions.
Security culture of the State Department was generally lacking in the kind of care for classified information that's found elsewhere in the U.S. government.
I mean, I remember vividly being in Peshawar, which is, I mean, I didn't like the ride from the airport to the embassy, which was 10 minutes. And we were there for, I don't know, a few hours and then out. The State Department personnel, they lived there and went out amongst the community. How do you try and strike that balance of, being present and at the same time meeting the security obligations?
Personal email was used for government work.
And then most importantly, who drives that decision? Because it seems to me in most instances, it is driven by the diplomatic corps there. If they take risks, it's because they've decided to do it. They're there. They know the security situation certainly better than the secretary and better than most everybody else. But what is the proper way to strike that balance going forward to protect our personnel and still fulfill their mission?
Congressman, I think that is the most important question, and I would certainly welcome congressional discussion and debate about this, because it's what we tried to do, going back to Congresswoman Duckworth's question, what we tried to begin to do in the quadrennial diplomacy and development review, the first one that was ever done, because that's exactly what we were facing. We have had diplomats and development professionals in war zones now for a number of years. We've had them in places that are incredibly unstable and dangerous because of ongoing conflicts. It is, I think, the bias of the diplomacy corps that they be there, because that's what they signed up for. And they know that if America is not represented, then we leave a vacuum and we lose our eyes and our ears about what people are thinking and doing. It is certainly the hardest part of the job in many of our agencies and departments today, and it was for me in the State Department. That's why I relied on the security professionals, because by the time I got there in 2009, the diplomatic security professionals had been taking care of American diplomats in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan for years. And they had learned a lot of lessons, and they were forced to make tough decisions all the time. You mentioned Peshawar, one of clearly the high threat posts that the United States maintains a presence in. But when you think that since 2001, we've had 100 of our facilities attacked. If we were to shut them all down, if we were to pull out from all of them, we would be blinding ourselves. So it's a constant balancing act. What are the risks and what are the rewards for opening, maintaining, and/or closing a site? I don't know that there's any hard and fast rule that we can adopt. We just have to get better at making that assessment, Congressman. And your question really goes to the heart of it.
Security culture of the State Department was generally lacking in the kind of care for classified information that's found elsewhere in the U.S. government.
When you were, as a member of Congress in Peshawar, you were guarded by our diplomatic security professionals. They had to assess, was it safe enough for a member of Congress to come? How do we get him from the airport to the embassy? It won't surprise you to hear we've had attacks there as so many other places around the world. And that is a heavy responsibility. And the diplomatic security professionals get it right 999 times out of 1,000. And it's deeply distressing to them when anything goes wrong. We have lost non-Americans with some of these attacks on facilities. We've lost our locally employed staff. They never want to see any successful attack. So they have to be right 100% of the time. The terrorists only have to be right once. And that's why this is really at the core of what I tried to do before even I got the Accountability Review Board, going back to the QDDR, to come up with a better way of trying to make those assessments.
Madam Secretary, if I may, just two final points. I mean, so the bottom line is Benghazi on 9/11/2012 was not the only dangerous place in the world where our security personnel were and where these difficult decisions had to be made.
Right.
And the other point I want to make before my time expires, now this was in 2012, so we were only a couple of years into this, but Secretary of Defense Ash Carter just, I think yesterday, wrote an editorial in the Wall Street Journal about the impact of 5 years of budget uncertainty on the DoD's ability to function. I mean, for 5 years, we have gone through CRs, threatened government shutdowns, one actual government shutdown, and constant budget uncertainty. Now, my area is the Department of Defense. I know how it's impacted them. They basically, from 1 week to the next, barely know what they can spend money on. Now, one of the criticisms there should have been more security. But if you don't have a budget, if you don't have an appropriations bill, how does that complicate your job as secretary in trying to figure out what money you can spend?
Well, it makes it very difficult, Congressman. And this is a subject that we talked about all the time. How do you plan? How do you know, you have so many diplomatic security officers in so many dangerous places. How do you know what you're going to have to be able to deploy? And where are you going to have to make the choices? That's why the prioritization, which shouldn't have to be, in my view, the responsibility of the officials in the State Department or the Defense Department to try to guess what makes the most sense. We should have a much more orderly process for our budget. And I will say again, as Secretary of State, the kind of dysfunction and failure to make decisions that we have been living with in our government.
Also developed evidence that the security culture of the State Department, in general, and with respect to the use of unclassified systems in particular, was generally lacking in the kind of care for classified information that's found elsewhere in the U.S. government.
Hurts us. It hurts us in the obvious ways, like where you're going to deploy forces if you're in DOD or where we're going to send security if you're in the Department of State. But it hurts us as the great country that we are, being viewed from abroad as unable to handle our own business. And so it has a lot of consequences. And it's something that I wish that we could get over and have our arguments about policy, have our arguments about substance, but get back to regular order where we have the greatest nation in the world with a budget that then they can plan against, as opposed to the uncertainty that has stalked.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. So the bottom line is Congress needs to do its job.
Right.
That would be
I agree with that.
The gentleman yields back, and I'll be happy to get a copy of my opening statement for the gentleman from Washington so he can refresh his recollection on all the things our committee found that your previous committee missed.